Good evening, and welcome to this Faith and Funders webinar run by the Church of Scotland Stewardship team. My name's Darren Phillip, and I'm one of the Stewardship team, along tonight with my colleagues Catherine Southern, who will be our main speaker, Fiona Penny, who's ensuring that all the technology runs smoothly, and Pauline Wilson, who is Stewardship team leader. We're also delighted to be joined by David Williams, Church of Scotland Grants Manager, and Dave Kendall, Church of Scotland Chief Officer. Before we begin, I'd like us to reflect on partnering with others in the mission of God as we read the first 6 verses of Paul's letter to the Philippians. From Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all God's people in Philippi who are in union with Christ Jesus, including the church leaders and helpers. May God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ give you grace and peace. I thank my God for you every time I think of you, and every time I pray for you all, I pray with joy, because of the way in which you have helped me in the work of the gospel from the very first day until now. And so I am sure that God, who began this good work in you, will carry it on until it is finished on the day of Christ. You are always in my heart, and so it's only right for me to feel as I do about you. For you have all shared with me in this privilege that God has given me. And so let's commit our time together in this webinar to God in prayer. Let's pray. It is a privilege indeed, God, that you have invited each of us to be part of your mission in the world. We pray that tonight may be a time of learning and insight as we explore how best we can partner with funders to further the work of your kingdom in our parishes. Send your Holy Spirit to challenge and inspire us, that we may fulfill your commission to make disciples of all people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Catherine Southern, who will lead us through tonight's main content. Catherine has great extensive experience in securing grant funding for a range of non-profit organisations and works regularly with congregations to help them resource their ministry. And we look forward to all she has to share tonight.
As Darren said, this evening we're going to be talking about trust and grant fundraising and how we can use this to support our call to discipleship. But before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to talk very briefly about the why of grant funding, if you will, and how grant funding can be a key part of our mission as a church. Next slide, Fiona. So our calling as a church is to advance mission and ministry, to act as the hands and feet of Christ in the world. And churches have a lot of great ideas about how to do this. In the stewardship team, we hear from congregations that are wanting to do transformative mission work, that are wanting to build spaces that can serve their communities, or who are wanting to share the good news through new ways of worship and teaching. But I think practically speaking, churches have trouble funding these great visions a lot of the time. And this is where grant funding can be a useful element of the funding strategy within a congregation. Because with the backing of funders, a congregation can undertake types of work that might otherwise be out of their reach. But I think it would be a mistake to think that grant funding is just about getting money. We should instead view grant funding in and of itself as an opportunity to build the kingdom. Applying for grants allows churches to partner with organizations and other individuals who share their values and their vision for a better world. I like this quote from theologian Henry Nouwen. He says, "Whether we are asking for money or giving money, we are drawn together by God, who is about to do a new thing through our collaboration." So throughout this evening, let us remember that our aim is ultimately to create new and lasting relationships with funders. We don't approach funders simply out of a desperate scramble for money, but out of a desire to work together for the kingdom of God. And when we adopt this mindset, our fundraising is transformed from merely a transactional activity into a confident, hope-filled, and I think joyful expression of ministry. Next slide. So in this webinar, we're going to cover what trust and grant fundraising is, how to plan a fundable project, how to find grants to apply for. We're going to cover some tips for writing successful applications, and then cover some tips for building relationships with funders. And then we'll open up for questions at the end. Next slide. One other concept I want to touch on, though, is something called the life cycle of fundraising. So as I mentioned before, we should be approaching grant funding as an opportunity to build relationships with individuals and with organizations who share the values that we hold dear. And not only does this align with our mission as Christians, but it's also so much easier to get repeat funding than it is to constantly churn through funders and have to find new funders and new partners. So as we go through this presentation, we'll be talking about each of these steps in this life cycle: researching funders, assessing their fit to our mission, reaching out, applying for funding, and building ongoing relationships. But the main takeaway is just think of grant funding not as a sort of one-off activity, but as an ongoing part of your funding picture. Next slide. So what are trusts, grants, and foundations? These are all entities that exist to give money and support to charitable organizations. So I'll be using the term trusts or funders throughout this presentation as a sort of shorthand for all of these types of organizations. Many of us will have heard of some of the really big funders like the National Lottery, or Garfield Weston is another one, but trusts come in all shapes and sizes. They can be set up by governments, by individuals, or by other organizations. And they vary in terms of the types of support that they provide. So some funders may just give money, but some will also give advice and support along with money. So for example, there are lots of heritage-related trusts that will give advice on preservation and restoration of historic buildings, for example. And trusts also vary in terms of both the amounts that they give and also the types of projects that they fund. So a lot of them will fund specific projects. So in the context of a church, they might provide funding for, say, a youth project or for a food pantry. Some funders will fund capital costs, which in most cases means building works. And some, though not that many, will fund running costs or, overheads. Some of them you'll also see will provide match funding, where the applicant will fundraise within their own networks, and then the trust will match that amount, in effect doubling the value of the donation. But what I want to touch on here in particular is the widespread belief that trusts will not fund churches or other religious organizations. This is partially true. So many funders will not fund projects with the explicit purpose of evangelism or promoting religion. But what we find is that they're often happy to fund community projects that are run by a church, so something that benefits the broader community. And it's important to word the application to that effect, which is something that we'll address later. There are also quite a few funders that will promote explicitly religious projects. Next slide. But before we even begin looking for funding, you need to have a strong project plan in place. While it's okay to adapt your plan to meet the different needs of funders, what you don't want to do is look for funding sources and then create projects around that. This creates, I think, organizational overstretch for one thing, but also just poor projects and poor applications. So before looking for funding, make sure that you can answer the following questions. The first is, why is your project needed, and how do you know that? So I'm going to use an example throughout this presentation that we'll keep coming back to. Let's say that your church is interested in starting a drop-in program for young people. If I was thinking about starting such a project in my church, I would want to address why a youth drop-in program is needed. So I might talk about things like rates of antisocial behavior in the community, or I might cite research showing that after-school programs or youth drop-ins are effective at stopping antisocial behavior. I'd also want to talk to young people, parents, and schools in the community to hear what sorts of interventions they feel would help to improve the lives of young people. In short, it's not enough to simply think that you have a good idea. What you're trying to do is justify and rationalize that idea for people who are unfamiliar with your church. And a lot of funders want to know that you've made efforts to actually reach out to the people you're trying to help. So the second set of questions relate to how. How are you going to create this change? So ask yourselves what kinds of results you want to achieve and how you're going to measure success. And why are you the best organization to deliver this project? So what we're really thinking about here is how you're going to know if your project is successful. Again, using a youth drop-in program as an example, you could measure success in a couple of ways. You might look at the number of young people attending the drop-in sessions. You might look at decreasing rates of antisocial behavior, or simply just positive feedback from young people and parents and carers. Things like this, clarifying how you're going to measure success, helps to establish what your vision is and how you're going to create change. You might also think about why your church is well placed to run a project. So perhaps you're located in the center of the community. Maybe you have experienced volunteers. Maybe you simply have the space to host such a project. But explain why your church is a good organization to deliver this. And finally, think explicitly about what it is that you are wanting to fund. So you need to ensure that you have a well thought out budget in place. So are you wanting, for example, to fund a session worker for the program? Or maybe you're seeking funding for games and equipment. Make sure you plan a budget with all of those costs accounted for, but also be sure to include cost recovery. This essentially is the overheads that support the project. So another example, let's say that your church employs a cleaner. If the building, the church building, is used 25% of the time for your youth project, then your budget should include 25% of the cleaner's salary as part of that. Similarly, you could also include 25% of your heating and lighting costs in your budget for the project. Not all funders will accept this kind of cost recovery, but a lot do, and it can be really helpful for ensuring the sustainability of both the project and of your church. And finally, just ensure that your church's finances are in reasonably good order. It's especially important to make sure that your Oscar accounts are up to date. So I'm using, as I said, a youth drop-in as an example throughout this presentation, but there are lots of projects that have the potential to attract external funding. So warm spaces, tea and coffee sessions, lunch clubs, toddler groups, craft groups, food larders, and building developments are just a couple of examples of the projects that we've seen attract funding from churches. Next slide. Okay, so once we have an idea of what our project is and what it's going to entail, then we can actually turn to looking for potential funders. Again, a lot of us will have heard of the really big funders like the National Lottery, but there are many, many other funders who don't have that kind of name recognition. And for many churches, smaller or especially local funders are really great partners. And there are a few different ways that we can find these less well-known funders. The first, and I think the most helpful, is to use a dedicated search database. These are websites and databases that compile information about different trusts. There are some paid services that you can use, but in Scotland, we have a great free resource called Funding Scotland. And this is the main tool that I would encourage you to use when you're looking for funders. So I'm going to show you a pre-recorded video now of how you can use the search tools on Funding Scotland to search for funders. Fiona, if you would switch over to that. So here I am on the Funding Scotland homepage. And let's say that I am looking for grant funders for the new youth drop-in program that my church is planning to start. Now, I could use this search bar here to start looking for funders, but I usually find it's more effective to go over to this tab that says funds. So what this is showing us is a list of all of the funders that Funding.Scot currently has information on, though it is limited to 20 pages. But even with that, we're seeing a total of 801 potential funders, which is not only far too many for us to look at, but also most of these funders probably won't be a good fit for us. You know, maybe they don't fund church projects, maybe they don't fund youth programs. So what we want to start to do is narrow down this total to only show those funders who are a really good fit for us. So the way that we do that is by using these filters over on the left. So we're going to go through each of these. So this first section is about our organization. So under this category, organization type, we have the choices registered charity, non-charity, and individual. My church is a registered charity, so I will click that. The next category is annual income. So let's say that the annual income for my church is £100,000. One tip here is make sure you don't put a comma in. See, if I do that, then we only have one funder. But if I get rid of the comma, we're back to 786. So just watch out for that. So this category, fund filters, the first sort of two tick boxes we see here are show funds opening soon and include closed funds. So if I click show funds opening soon, that shows us only those funds that are just about to open. But I am wanting, you know, a broader search than that. So I'm going to leave both of these boxes unticked. So the next category is activities. So this is the kinds of charitable activities that we engage in. And we have some broad categories like advice and justice, arts, culture, recreation, community support and development, etc. So what I'm looking for here are any sorts of tick boxes that relate to young people, youth work, or religious activities. So I see here that religious activities is a choice. So I'm going to click that. Now I want to address this because it is true that a lot of funders do not fund religious activities. But that being said, if a funder explicitly does fund religious activities, then it's probably more likely that they're going to fund a church project. However, some funders who state that they don't fund religious activities may still consider funding, you know, a mission project or something like that if it's not explicitly evangelical in nature. But that being said, I want to go ahead and tick religious activities just to see, you know, how many funders we end up with. But if it ended up being quite restrictive, then I might go back and untick that. So let's see if there's anything related to youth or young people. I'm not seeing anything at the moment. You know, it's possible maybe that stuff within this category of communities support and development might fit, but I'd like to keep our search criteria pretty broad at the moment. So I'll just leave religious activities ticked for now. Okay, see, we're already down to 76 funders, which is a manageable number. Next, let's go to beneficiaries. Look, I'm seeing young people here, and let's see, religious and belief groups are also a beneficiary. So I'll go ahead and tick that again. Then we go to geographical areas funded. I'll make sure to click Scotland, also the UK. And I'm based in Dundee, so I'm going to click Tayside as well. Oftentimes, you'll have a better chance of getting funding if a funder, you know, focuses exclusively on your area for funding. Then we go to type of cost. Our choices are capital, core costs, and revenue. So if you're not familiar, capital costs are those associated with, buying things that will last over a long period of time. So usually that means like buildings or land or things like that. Core costs are those that are essential to the running of an organization, salaries, insurance, that kind of stuff. And revenue tends to be costs explicitly associated with a certain project. So in our case, it might be, funding for a youth session worker or something like that. So for the youth drop-in, I'm going to go ahead and click both core costs and revenue. And then we have type of funding, corporate, equipment, grants, loans. I'm going to just leave all of those unticked for the time being. And then finally, source of fund, we have options like community benefit, European lottery, etc. I'm not feeling picky, so I'll leave that. So once we've applied all of these filters, we've got it down to a total of 53 potential funders, which is still a lot, but I think pretty manageable for us to go through and to evaluate, which we will talk about momentarily. Right. So as I said before, I think that Funding Scotland is really one of the best tools available to us. But you can also do a couple of other things to look for potential funders. The first is just looking in the news for stories about funders. You can sign up to Google Alerts, and Google will notify you anytime information comes up about funders in your local area, funding for churches, things like that. And that can be a good way to just stay up to date with the news and new opportunities. The other one I would say is use word of mouth. Ask other churches in your area about funding they have received. I think it can be quite tempting to sort of hold on to our funders and try and, protect them and keep them for us. But the way that funding works is if a funder has already funded another church in the local area, it's a lot more likely that they will also fund your church. So it's really good to sort of share information with one another. And it's also worth mentioning that the Church of Scotland Grants Unit puts out information about funders. They have a list of over 60 potential funders, which we can share after this event. And the General Trustees have also produced a list of funders who specifically fund building-related projects for churches. And I've included a link to that here. And finally, also just sign up for the newsletter from the Stewardship team if you haven't already, because we often share information about funding opportunities as well. Next slide. So once we have a sort of a list of potential funders, what we want to do is a bit of further research to ensure that they're a good fit for us. The number one reason that applications get rejected is because they are ineligible or do not meet the stated funding criteria. So finding out as much as possible about a potential funder will prevent you from submitting ineligible applications and strengthen those applications that you do submit. So there are a couple of pieces of information that you'll want to look for. First, most importantly, do you meet the funder's stated criteria? Second, have they given to causes like yours in the past? And third, how much do they typically give? So again, there's a few ways that we can find out this information. The first is simply, do they have a website? Large funders often have websites, but increasingly we also see smaller funders that have dedicated websites as well. So as your first port of call, just Google them and see what information they have publicly available. But the next thing you want to do is also look for their annual reports or annual accounts. These are really valuable because they can often show you who the trust has given to in the past and how much they've given. As I said before, if a trust has given to a project that is similar to yours in the past, then it is much more likely that they will give to you as well. So I'm going to show you a second video where I show you how to go through the accounts and find this information, and then we'll come back to this slide.
Here's the list that we generated before of funders that we might want to look at in a bit more detail. So what I would do at this point is try and get a sort of high-level overview of these and determine which ones I want to research in more detail. So we'll click on a couple of these and see what information we have. So starting with Hugh Fraser Foundation, you can see I've clicked on it. We've ended up on this page where there's a little bit more information. Some of it is hidden behind a paywall here for if you sign up for the premium funding.scot service, but quite frankly, there's a lot of information we can find out without having to do that. So let's see. So this says that it makes donations to registered charities, that its objectives are quite broad, that they're particularly interested in applications from parts of Scotland where the local economy and circumstances make fundraising for charitable purposes difficult. That looks like it could potentially be one worth looking at in more detail. But normally what I would do at this point is start researching that one. But I want to kind of have a look and see what else we ended up with first. So we'll click on this one, the Pristaman Charity Responsive Grants. Look at a little more detail. Let's see. Nothing here to indicate that it would not be a good fit for us. Again, we have, details up here, information about the types of funds that they provide, information about who can apply. You can see that you need to be a charity between 25,000 and 500,000 in income. And there's information again on how to apply and when to apply. Okay, so both of those are worth looking at in a bit more detail. What I'm looking for right now really is one that doesn't look like a good fit. And it looks like that might be it. So here we have the AMW Charitable Trust. Okay, so they do fund religious projects, promotion of spiritual, moral, intellectual, social, and physical well-being. Okay, that all sounds good. But then here we see the funder gives priority to applications from the west of Scotland. So I am based in Dundee, so it's a little less likely that that is going to be a good fit for me. So I think maybe what I want to do instead is research one of these in a bit more detail. So this one looked promising. Let's go ahead and click back to that. What I want to do now is find out a little bit more information about who they have funded in the past. Because if we can see that they have funded other youth programs or other churches, then it increases the chance that they would in turn fund us. So what I'm going to do is Google them. And it looks like they have a website, which is great because a lot of funders don't have websites, and it's always helpful when they do. So let's see. Here's a little introduction about them. We're just going to skim it. If you were doing this on your own, I would say absolutely take the time to read this in detail, but we're just having a quick look here. So, oh, look at this. Perfect. So we have some New Testament there, and some of their grants are specifically linked to Christian work. Fabulous. We love to see it. That makes it more likely that they will fund our project. Okay, great. And then they have a little bit more information about their grant making programs and information about how to apply. But I see up here as well that they have past grant awards. So I'd like to have a quick look at that. So here's some information about who they have funded, and what am I seeing here? I'm seeing that most of their funding lies between £500 and £1,000. So that's sort of where the amount that we would want to be looking for from them. And I'm also seeing, look, we have some youth projects, and looking down here, we also, ooh, look at that. We got Church of Scotland in there. That's great. So that means that it's a good likelihood that they would consider an application from us. Okay, so that looks like one that we could definitely do more work with in the future. Again, there's information here about how to apply and stuff like that, so that's something that I would normally take the time to read, but I want to have a look at one other funder. So let's go back to our search results here, and let's look at trying to decide which one. Let's say this one, the A.H. Salveson Charitable Trust. Now, I should note here as well that the Salveson Trust has historically been a supporter of the Church of Scotland's work, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to be looking at them as if I did not already know that. Okay, let's Google that. Okay, so it doesn't look like they have a website, but what I wanted to show you here is their page on Oscar, the Scottish Charity Regulator. So what I often find is really helpful, particularly if they don't have a website, is to look at their annual accounts. So what I'm looking for this particular funder is a list of projects that they have funded in the past year. And there's often usually, other good information in here under things like objectives and activities, which I would, again, absolutely recommend you take the time to read. But for the time being, what I am looking for is, wait for it. Okay, let's see. So we have our financial activities. Aha, this is it. This is what I wanted to see. So turn that the right way around. And we have a list of who they funded in the past year. Looks like they have funded a church, which is great. And yep, 2 churches on there. Perfect. So I'm not seeing really, I don't think I'm seeing anything directly related to young people. We do have scholarships and things like that. So, education. Yeah. So, I mean, there's potential here. Um, they're definitely one I would want to look at in a bit more detail. And what's also useful is seeing, again, how much they've given. So it looks like they give a couple of big grants a year and then a handful of smaller ones. So this is the sort of research that I would typically try to do for all of the um, funders that I'm potentially interested in. And you'll find that, you're starting with this list of 53, but it will get narrowed down to sort of the top funders who you think are an absolute great fit for your organization. And those are the ones I would prioritize. Sometimes there are also ones where you're not 100% sure, but there's still pretty good fit. And depending on what your funding is looking like, it can be worth pursuing those as well.
Great. So there was just a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to going through this process of researching funders. I really recommend contacting the funder directly. So what you can do is call or email them and ask about their funding priorities, or even ask for clarification about items in the application. And the reason we do this is it serves a dual purpose. The first is you do get more information that can be helpful in actually writing your application, but it also shows that you're taking the funder seriously and not just blindly firing off applications. There's a saying that's helpful here, which is ask for my money, get my advice. Ask for my advice, get my money. So taking that extra time to actually get directly in contact with the funder can really show, as I said, that you're taking them seriously. And it's worth emphasizing here as well that funders, especially in this day and age, get a lot of applications, but a lot of them are really, really bad, with no reference to the funder or their priorities, just a very generic application. So we just want to kind of stand out from the crowd in that way. Next slide. So once we have narrowed down our list and actually decided to apply to a funder, then you of course need to actually write the application. And again, it shouldn't be a surprise. My biggest tip here is to adapt your application to the funder. And this consists of more than just changing the name of the funder in the application. You want to explicitly state why your application is a good fit for them with reference to their funding priorities. So an example, in that last video, we looked at the website of the Peristomen charity, and they state that their name comes from the Greek and means to stand beside. So when I'm writing my application, I might pick up on that concept and talk about coming alongside young people in our youth project. I do this again to show that I've really read the materials and thought about the fit. The other thing is how we go about addressing religion. So for funders that state that they are open to applications promoting religion, then you can really emphasize the work that you're doing to share the good news, really use some of the language that we use within the church and share scripture, all those sorts of things. But if your funder says that they do not fund religious projects, we don't need to hide the fact that we're a church, but instead we just want to shift our focus a little bit. So I might instead really focus on the benefits to the wider community, again, looking at things like benefits to young people. And if I were applying for the youth program from a non-religious funder, I might explicitly say something like that the program is open to everyone in the community, regardless of their belief. And I might emphasize those general community benefits rather than focusing on young people joining the church as my primary success metric. So again, it's just slightly adapting depending on what your funder's priorities are. And again, you want to address the following questions in your application, which we thought about during the sort of project planning stage. First, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How do we know it's a problem? Second, what is your intended solution? How do you know it will work? And remember that when answering these questions, it's really important to use evidence and examples. Don't assume that your funder knows the same information that you do. So on our next couple of slides, which we'll get to in a minute, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of ways you can really improve and enhance your writing to appeal to funders. But I just want to share a couple of other tips first. The first is that using AI writing tools like ChatGPT can be really useful, but you need to be cautious. What I do not recommend is just submitting or asking ChatGPT to write your whole application for you. It's really obvious for one thing, and it also will just result in a poorly written application. But instead, if you're stuck on writing a particular section, ChatGPT or other AI services can be really useful, but just again, make sure that you're editing whatever it spits out. And then second, while many funders have set application forms, what you'll see a lot of times, particularly for smaller funders, is they'll just say apply in writing. What they're wanting you to do is submit a sort of proposal of your own design. And what I recommend here is tailoring the length of your application to the amount of funding requested. So again, an example, if I were applying to a funder and asking for a relatively small amount, like 500 pounds, what I would do is I would write a 1 to 2 page application where I again go through those questions about the problems I'm trying to solve, what the solution is. And then I would send that as a hard copy or an email to the funder, along with a covering letter and a copy of my annual accounts. So that's a really good kind of format to use for a lot of funders. 1 to 2 page report, covering letter, copy of annual accounts. But if I were applying for a larger amount of money, say 5,000 pounds, what I would do is increase the length of my application slightly and include a bit more detail. So maybe some more quotes from young people, maybe a bit more evidence or examples. But again, you'll want to include a cover letter and a copy of your accounts. And last general writing tip is to just pay attention to detail. Just check your spelling, make sure that you have changed the name of the funder in the application. And if you're sending in hard copies of the application, just use nice paper, make sure the printer has plenty of ink, just make it look sort of neat and professional. So now I just want to go through a couple examples of how to improve writing. And again, the reason we're doing this is because a lot of funders receive quite poor applications. So really taking the time to write a nice application helps a huge amount. Next slide, please. So if I was trying to describe the problem in an application, one way you could say that is youth are exhibiting more and more antisocial behavior. That's sort of true, but it doesn't share the kind of evidence needed to back up that statement. So a better way to say that is to say something like, recent studies indicate a 25% increase in antisocial behavior among youth in our community over the past 3 years. These behaviors, which include truancy, vandalism, and substance abuse, are contributing to lower academic performance and higher dropout rates. Without intervention, this trend is likely to continue, further straining local schools and community resources. So the statement on the right is stronger because it includes evidence and concrete descriptions of the problem. It could be further improved by using quotes from young people or case studies from people in the community. Next slide. Similarly, if I'm trying to describe the proposed solution to a problem, I could simply say, our church's youth drop-in program will help stop youth antisocial behavior. Much better way to say that is, our church's youth drop-in program will address the rising antisocial behaviors among youth by providing a safe and structured environment after school. The program will offer mentorship from trained volunteers, engaging recreational activities, sorry, I lost my place here, and educational workshops on conflict resolution and substance abuse prevention. By fostering positive relationships and enhancing life skills, we aim to reduce antisocial behaviors and improve overall youth well-being in our community. And again, the statement on the right could be further enhanced by describing how you're going to measure success, or including quotes from parents or young people supporting the proposed project. Next slide. So now, finally, we want to talk a little bit about relationship building. As I said, it is much easier to get repeat funding than to apply for new funding. So it's really important that we try and establish positive relationships with our funders. The first thing you want to do is, if you are successful, thank the funder immediately upon notification of your award. I've been on the flip side of the funding equation where I'm evaluating applications, and I can't tell you the number of people who don't acknowledge when you have awarded them money, and then you have to go chase them up. It's not a good look, so just make sure you say thank you straight away. The next thing to think about is sending project updates. So many funders will state in the terms of the award that you need to send an update, usually every 6 months or once a year, something like that. But even if this isn't a requirement, you should still plan to send an update partway through the funding period. Just a description of sort of the positive outcomes you're seeing, how things are going in the project generally. Another really good thing to do is to actually invite the funder to come and see the project. Most funders will not accept the invitation, but the gesture again shows real consideration. And if they do say yes, great, then you could invite them to a drop-in session and really get to show off the project and the great work that you're doing. But ultimately, just remember what we said at the beginning of the evening. Our goal is not only to gain funding, but to work in meaningful partnership with our funders to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world. Great. And so I'm happy for us to go ahead and open up for questions.
We have one question in so far, which is around the assumptions that funders might have, particularly if we're dealing with a non-religious funder that may have assumptions that our society is not particularly religious, or may be skeptical about the ability of the church to deliver on some of these projects. And what should we say to them? How do we convince them that this is something worth funding?
David, I'm wondering if you, I know you have some thoughts around this, if you want to maybe jump in.
Sure. There's two reports been produced by the National Churches Trust in the past year, 18 months or so. First one was looking at the general benefit of church and society. The more recent one is called the House of Good Health, and that's looking at the impact of churches on the benefit to the National Health Service. Both of them are really good reading, and I think would illuminate people who don't really understand that churches can provide a lot of benefit to community and to society.
Thanks, David. Does anyone want to add anything?
I mean, not a huge amount to that. I think turning to evidence in the first instance is a really good thing. But I think really just trying to emphasize that your church is sort of a place of connection, or a place that the community is involved in, just emphasizing that you are really sort of on the ground and able to connect with people directly in your immediate area or in your wider community. And really explicitly stating that can also help to clarify that for a lot of funders.
Great, thank you. We've got a really practical question from someone who's enjoyed the presentation. They said it was excellent, and will a hard copy of that presentation be available for folks?
Yeah, afterwards we're gonna send out it might take a couple of days, but we'll send out a recording of this. We'll send out a copy of the slides, and we'll also share some of the additional resources that we mentioned, like the list of funders and building funders for building projects, that kind of thing.
We've got a question about repeat funding. How does repeat funding relate to each new application needing to be for a new project? So perhaps there's a funder that specifically says a new application is for a new project. Is that relationship building still important? How does that relate to repeat funding?
Yeah, so if a funder is saying that they are only looking for applications for, new projects and you've applied to them previously for a different project, I still think that that work that you have done with them previously is really important, right? You've already taken the time to show them that you take them seriously. You have hopefully been thanking them and reporting along the way, so they can really trust that you are a good, person or organization to deliver this kind of work. Does that answer the question, or does anyone have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
helpful. We've got a question about funding applications. Are you aware of good examples of successful funding applications? Is there any way that successful applications can be shared?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tricky sometimes because I don't have a huge number personally of successful applications from church contexts to other funders. But I'm wondering, maybe, David, is that something that is available through the grants team at all?
I think the examples you gave were looking in church accounts about where people may be receiving funding from is quite useful. So if you see there's someone at one of your neighbour churches who have had successful application from the grant body you're applying to, then go straight to that church and say, can we see your application? Use the networks of being peer-to-peer Church of Scotland churches, and that should be quite supportive.
Perhaps this is for David or for Catherine. Our food bank in Warm Space has been running, but is struggling to keep going. Will funders be open to funding a project that's already up and running, perhaps for a few years?
Yes, is the short answer. I would say so. Some of them will explicitly state new projects, but a lot of times funders are really open to that. I will say, in the case of Warm Spaces in particular, I think that there is a organization operating in Scotland that really works to provide funding and advice to Warm Spaces. Do you remember? I think you sent it to me, David. Do you remember what it's called?
If you sign up for the Warm Welcome
Warm
campaign,
Welcome.
that's at warmwelcome.uk. They have a list of potential funders on their website. And also sometimes, not guaranteed, if you're in an area of multiple deprivation, they may provide grants without you even knowing that it's coming your way. So definitely worth signing up for the warmwelcome.uk website and seeing both their list of funders and also potentially receiving funding without even realizing that you can apply for it.
Alistair is asking if we can discuss net zero projects. Is there any advice specifically for those?
Yeah, that is a good question. I will confess that that is an area that I have slightly less direct experience with. But there are lots of, funders around for different sorts of building and sustainability projects. I wonder, David, if you have any more comment on that as well.
Yes, so general trustees are probably the first port of call for asking about that sort of activity. And also Eco Congregation Scotland as well would also have some expertise in that area. There has been some work we've done recently in the past couple of years with the CARES programme that was government funded, but I think it's coming to an end shortly, so too late now, I think, to make an application to them, but check that with Eco Congregation Scotland. But it is something more of a capital nature rather than a revenue-based activity.
Question asking if we can visit congregations to offer advice and so on, and if so, what's the timeline for that? I'm happy to answer that one. Myself, Fiona and Pauline are happy to visit any congregation. We work on a regional basis. We are spread out around the country, so wherever you are, one of us will not be too far away, and we're more than happy to come and learn about your context and help give you some tailored advice that fits your situation. And there's no real timeline to that. You can drop us an email. We'll pop the email address in the chat. It's stewardship@churchofscotland.org.uk, and we'll be in touch with you within a few days. Another practical, technical question. If we receive a grant, is this included in the calculation regarding payments for Giving to Grow or to a presbytery or so on?
Yeah, grant income is not included in the calculation of the Giving to Grow contribution. It's not included in assessable income. So that's good news.
We've had a few related questions which acknowledge that to do this well, as has been put across in the presentation, might take time and energy, and many churches perhaps already have a small number of people doing quite a few jobs and might be struggling with time. So one person's asking, what do we think of outsourcing the grant applications to an outside group? Someone else is asking, can you apply for funding to help support you with that? How do we help congregations that are perhaps slightly resource poor on finding the time to fill in grant applications?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. It is tricky, and doing it well does take time. I will say one thing is, I do emphasize adapting to funders, but once you do have sort of one application written and your project planned out, it's a lot easier to apply to subsequent ones. So that is one tip I would keep in mind. I will say as well, I can't speak for my colleagues on this, but I am always happy to review applications. I won't typically write them for you, but if you send me drafts, I'm always happy to give feedback and advice in that regard as well. Regarding working with outside organizations, David may have some additional comments on this. I think the one thing I would watch out for is trying to figure out a diplomatic way to say this. There are a fair number of charlatans out there, or just people with fairly limited experience grant funding. So I always recommend exercising a degree of caution and making sure that if you were to look at hiring someone external, that you can talk to other people who've used their services and can report positively on them. That's kind of what I would say about that. What about you, David?
Yes, if you're looking for something that's a sort of quite a large program, you could avail yourselves of the Accelerate program. That's something run by Community Enterprise, which is a charity based in Scotland. They're funded by Scottish Government, and they're there to provide between 5 days of work as a consultant towards your congregation. And they can help you to put together an overall funding strategy for what you want to do, and help you also to start to sift through the sorts of organizations you might be applying to. So that's a really helpful form of support you can find. But again, you have to go through the Accelerate program, sign up as an interested party, and get back to you, and then evaluate whether they can support you.
Another question that's perhaps slightly linked is, if the project your church is currently working on are very heavily dependent on volunteers, and that means you're struggling to maintain that, will there be funders out there who might be open to funding a member of staff to help ease some of that volunteer pressure?
What I would say about that is that you need to be really explicit about what that staff member is doing. So yeah, there are absolutely funders who will fund members of staff, but they need to be for specific things. I have heard from churches just say generally, like, we want more help, but you need to be a bit more specific about that. So like I said before, if you wanted somebody, for example, to be a youth session worker or to manage like that aspect of the project specifically, that's a lot easier to get funding for. Start again from that kind of project planning premise and have a really good sense of how this person is going to fit into your project plan before you turn to looking for funding for that post.
I'd probably say that you're better off applying for a project that employs someone rather than applying to a funder for a post. Yeah. Because if you just apply for a post, you haven't really explained what the project will do and how it will fit together with the other elements of what you're doing. So always try and have, unless they specify otherwise in the literature for that funder, apply for a project that will employ someone rather than a post.
Correct, yeah.
An interesting question here. If you have applied for funding for a project and you've been successful, but during delivering the project, you realise that what you had imagined isn't really working as you'd hoped, and you need to change direction. Is that okay? And how do funders react to when the project has to be changed midway?
Yeah, it happens. I think that's pretty normal. And I think really it's fundamentally about communication, right? So when you think that you might have to change some things, get in touch with your funder and explain what you're planning to do differently, or essentially just kind of rationalize why you're making those decisions. But fundamentally, if you keep communication lines open, I think a lot of funders are pretty flexible and pretty understanding about that kind of thing.
We've got a question about the approval processes that are often needed internally within the Church of Scotland. And someone is asking, is there any way the Church of Scotland can speed up how we get approval for things? They had recently submitted a form for building works, which has to go to Presbytery and the General Trustees, but the timescale feels quite long and potentially means you can miss funding deadlines. I don't know if that's something anyone wants to comment on.
In the first instance, in that case, approach the General Trustees. There are now building officers also working in most presbyteries, so speak to them as well. They might be able to help grease the wheels a bit on the system. But many of these things have been in place for a reason, and they do have to go through quite some levels of detail and making sure that things are going to be done right. But yeah, in the first instance, speak to the GCs.
I think maybe that question is one that we can provide a bit more content on in the follow-up material. We can go away and just get a bit of information about why is the process so long, and just knowing what's involved in that can sometimes be helpful as well. And if it's long for no good reason, then perhaps just us asking the question might have an impact as well.
There's a question here that's in two parts. It's about recording, I presume recording services to relay those to the wider community. Is that the sort of thing you can apply for funding for? And the second part of the question is, if you've funded something like that yourself, can you then apply for funding after it's complete to reimburse what has been spent?
Yes to the first one, no to the second one. Yeah. So yes, I think you can get funding for that kind of thing. But especially if you can find a funder that is really open to explicitly religious projects. But almost no funder will fund retroactive costs. So you need to apply for the funding before you buy stuff.
We have a question here from a church which will be 200 years old next year and needs extensive repair work, possibly in the region of £100,000. It's category B listed. Would applications to support that be better spread across several funders?
It really depends on the nature of the project, but generally I would say yes. If you are applying for, unless you have a funder who is really very excited about that particular project, I would say that most of the time when you're trying to fund really large amounts of money, going to multiple funders is kind of the way to go on that. David, any additional comments?
I'd probably look for some support from the National Churches Trust Cherish program. Karen Hind is the lady who looks after Scotland, and what she doesn't know about funding for church projects isn't worth knowing. So very well connected, knows where to go for different sorts of funding, and will let you know if something isn't going to work. So definitely worth having a go at that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great resource as well.
If several churches were developing along the same themed approach, for example, lots of churches in an area were working on community support for older people, is there any role that we can play in the national office in helping to avoid duplication of effort between churches that are working towards similar aims or might be approaching the same potential funders?
Duplication is still a risk at the moment. I would say it's probably best to try and maintain open lines of communication with churches in the area anyway, to have a sort of a sense of what they're planning. You know, and I think it's also within the realm of possibility to, you know, look at joint working. If you had a couple of churches working together on a certain project, I think that could potentially increase the attractiveness to a potential funder as well. So I think maybe my first suggestion would just be to communicate in and around your sort of immediate area. Any other comments from anyone on that?
And potentially as well check through presbytery.
Yeah.
I know presbyteries can be very large now, but perhaps work with the local area. There's equivalent of deanery groups. Then it may be worthwhile just sharing amongst yourselves and seeing what's possible and what's out there.
And a final question that I wonder if I could direct towards you, David, which is to ask about Seeds for Growth. And if anyone on the call hasn't heard of Seeds for Growth, what is it and who should they speak to?
Okay. So Seeds for Growth is the Church of Scotland's nationally funded programme with a headline of £25 million to be allocated over the next 7 years or next 6.5 years. We've already allocated over £1 million to projects across the country. There are 3 main project areas. There's new Western communities and planting new churches. There's working with the under 40s. And there's also expanding current congregations and improving discipleship as well. That was added at last General Assembly. If you're interested, if you go to the Church of Scotland website and just put in Seeds for Growth, you'll come up with the right web pages. There's plenty of information there about we have 4 different levels of funding, from level 1 funds of £1,000 to try something out, to give a little bit of money to give something a go. It could be for a one-off event even, all the way through to £100,000 a year for up to 3 years, possibly extending to 5 years, which would be probably at presbytery level, possibly for a large church or multiple churches working together. But all of those things are possible with Seeds for Growth from level 1 to level 4 funding. Please do take a look at the website. Any questions, get in contact with the grants team at grants@churchofscotland.org.uk. That's grants@churchofscotland.org.uk.
Brilliant, thank you. And as we said earlier, we will put all of this information into a follow-up email for you so that you have everything from tonight at your hands. Last minute question that's just come in asking, is there funding available to support broadband connections in rural churches? These buildings are not included in the Fibre to Property initiative.
That is not something that I know off the top of my head. It's certainly something that we can look into. I will say that's one where it could potentially be a good fit for money in the Consolidated Fabric Fund. If your church has any sort of holdings in that, it might be worth looking into. But that's one where I would probably just, search for funding for, connections in rural areas, that kind of thing, and see if anything, shows up.
Well, thank you, everyone. There are no more questions coming in at the moment. So thank you for your questions, and thank you to the panel for dealing with such a range of topics and so expertly. We've also been joined tonight by Dave Kendall, that's our Chief Officer, and I just want to take this opportunity to see if Dave wants to add anything at this point.
Yes, I'd love to add a couple of points, actually. First of all, well done, Catherine. It was a super presentation, very enlightening. As well as being the Chief Officer here, I chair a small charity in East Kilbride, and I can validate absolutely everything you said about things like repeat funding. We've managed to get repeat funding from the same donor, if you like, for repeat projects, as long as we've successfully shown that we delivered the first one, basically. So as long as you get that coming together, they do seem to like to fund success. And in fact, the importance of the relationships and offering the visits, and particularly the saying thank you, that really does work very, very well. And in fact, I've had an occasion funders come and tell me about them pushing out some new initiatives and saying, do you think you might have something that might contribute to this? So once those relationships are built, it's really, really positive, I think, in that space. I've outsourced as well on occasion to authors for specialist support when I've been going for bigger bids. And as long as you know those people to help, and that they're, they've got a good reputation, and once you know and work with them, they can help a little bit of contribution to future bids as well. So it works, but normally we've just done that ourselves with this kind of support you're talking about here. So all of the things you've said have rung so true to me. I only wish we'd had this before, so we could have learned from having the presentation to help us with it. So I'd really encourage everybody on the call to use this. It is true to say that more and more people are going for grants now. We've had experience recently of what used to be a 5 to 10, maybe going up to 30 to 40 numbers of applicants for sort of bids of the amount of funding available. But that hasn't deterred us, and we've still managed to get the money coming in. So I'm sure that we can do exactly the same using all the great techniques and tools that you've presented here. So I'm really, really pleased with what happened tonight. And I think everybody's exactly right in saying it's been excellent. So well done, all of you. And the panel in particular, answering all those questions just cold. And some of them were pretty good questions, I have to say. So well done, everybody.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to a close for this evening. So thank you all. We had a lot of discussion in the Q&A about how much people contribute to their local church and how often it can be very time intensive. And all of you on here have given up another evening of your time this evening. And I hope it's been well spent. And we'd like to thank you for all that you do in serving God where you are. Please stay in touch. The email addresses for the stewardship team and the grants unit are in the chat box. Please let this just be the start of a conversation. It can feel like a bit of a minefield sometimes, but we're here to help you. And if there's anything at all we can do, please be in touch. So thanks for your attendance, and good night, and God bless.